Hello everybody and welcome. I am Sam Gould and today I'm going to be touching upon very briefly some ongoing research relative to what the title suggests in terms of the ontogenesis of the self as a psychophysiological process and operation. So I'm going to touch very briefly upon where this problematic arises relative to its history and genealogy, and re-emerge a particular structural component that might be useful in operationalizing individuation, and what are its ongoing questions and where does it take us relative to uncovering a possible operationalizing of this notion of the self as a vital quality. So first and foremost, very briefly, there are predominantly four important personnel within the history of this concept of individuation. Aristotle was the first individual to come up with some type of formation relative to the individuation process, which is relative to his notion of hylomorphism, which I'm going to touch upon very soon. Duns Scotus was another individual who came up with an idea in response to Aristotle that was more to do with understanding and framing a reference for an indivisible quality that he related to this idea of hexeity, a thisness quality. Carl Jung, more recently, his idea of individuation was more in terms of its psychological development relative to this idea of self-realization. And then much more recently, in some ways contemporaneously, Gilbert Simondon came up with a much more biophysiological operation of individuation that has particular stages of development that moves from chemical to biological to psychological, vital, and what he terms as trans-individual, which I'm going to be touching upon very briefly soon. The notion of hylomorphism that Aristotle touched upon has to do with two particular components, the idea of form and matter, and the relationship between those two qualities. An example of a hylomorphic process can be exemplified in the notion of a brick. You take a particular substance, a material substance such as matter, with its particular constituents. For example, maybe there's some water, there's some sand, some other things that are involved in the particular matter of a brick, and you take a form, a mold, some type of structure of which the matter goes into, which structures, molds, forms what can emerge out of both of these two things, which is resulting in the idea of a brick. So we have this process of which something is emerging from this relationship between matter as it is formed via this developmental process. The hylomorphic schema implies a form of, in some sense, epigenesis, of which an organism or substance comes into being from conception through formation. This generation implies the molding of matter through form throughout its entirety and process. So that's a little bit about the notion of hylomorphism, which takes us into what Simondon has attempted to operationalize, which is in direct response to try to overcome this hylomorphic template. And rather than matter being formed by something to create some epiphenomenal proposition or substance quality, we have this notion of stages of development from what Simondon refers to as the pre-individual stage, which is pure potential, oftentimes referred to as chemical constituents that are making up the foundation of different forms and qualities within reality. From there we have biological individuation, so the development of tissues, different types of structures such as within different organisms that are defining different organisms. And in the particular case of human individuation, you have the psychic component. So there's psychic development or psychological development related to this individuation process that's growing out of first this pure potential state of pre-individual quality that is then manifesting throughout biological individuation as it continues to develop, and on and into the development of different types of brain and cognitive states. And then finally, for Simondon, we have the state of the trans-individuation process, which is this component of the collective individual moments or instances of individuation that are coming together and developing a collective stage of trans-individuation. So hence you have this idea of not so much a hierarchical standing, even though that's definitively involved in this process, but there's also this idea of information that is moving across different phases of information. So for example, rather than information, for instance, moving up and down through these particular states of, let's say, developmental unfolding, you also have at each stage information that's moving across, that's allowing each stage to, let's say, form itself in the development of itself in relationship to its larger constituent mold or place in being relative to the organism in which it's inhabited in. So for example, chemical constituents that have particular types of processes, and in the midst of those processes create different types of biological formation. So we have different systems in the body. We might point towards the immune system, the endocrine system, etc. And then within those systems, we have different types of systems that come together to create different types of phenomena from the interaction of those systems, such as different psychic or psychological states, mental states. And so from that phase of psychic development, then we have that trans or social collective individuation process. Simondon often relates this unfolding or developmental individuation process to the idea of crystallization as an analogy. The idea of crystallization really harnesses this developmental unfolding from the idea of, in this case, a crystal, where you have particular minerals and chemicals that are involved in a kernel state of which crystallization can develop. And so what happens with the crystal is, rather than development taking place at the center of the kernel, you have different materials that are manifesting growth at the periphery or right at the outer limit of the crystallization process. So what happens is you have different layers of developmental unfolding that start to emerge. And this idea of the crystal as an analogy perfectly encapsulates what Simondon is trying to capture within the individuation process. That is to say, there is no end point in individuation. All there is individuation making way for more instances of individuation. And in some respects, he relates this to two different phenomena. One is that change occurs via a metastable state. So in this place between stability and instability, do we get new phenomena that emerge via the pure potential capacity of that pre-individual state that's always at each level of development. And additionally, you have this notion of, which Simondon refers to as transduction within and of a metastable system, whereby information can maneuver without direct contact within particular systems in relationship to one another. So for instance, that idea of the pre-individual phase is what is occurring at each developmental phase of unfolding within each individuation process relative to the larger unfolding of that trans-individuation operation. So the idea of crystallization is a perfect analogy for this developmental unfolding. Again, with the pre-individual occurring in a metastable condition between stability and instability, phase shifts can occur or change states can occur that continue this individuation process. Thus, the ontogenesis of the individual occurs via the metastable state of the pre-individual potential in charge. Trans-individuation is a form of psychosocial individuation. Its origin is neither social or individual. As Simondon suggests, trans-individual action is what makes it such that individuals exist together as the elements of a system that contains potentials and metastability, expectation, and tension within a system. So rather than thinking of this trans-individual state as a collection of individuals, we might take a step back and think of the trans-individuation much like the pre-individual phase of development, whereby developmental organization is taking place at both points on the scale of organization, one much more macro and one much more minute relative to the chemical and mineral constituents that are making way for these particular possibilities to emerge in developmental unfolding. So within this, we start to arrive at this intersection of what are the possibilities that might emerge from Simondon's model of individuation or developmental unfolding. And one particular place that we can look to is the idea of mitochondria within a cell. Mitochondria have a key play in the production of energy and metabolic states in the body. But what's interesting about the idea of mitochondria is that they're arriving from and descending from both archaea and bacteria which are present in the cell. So there's a sense of a primordial quality that's existing genealogically prior to the human species that's then developmentally arrived and playing a key part in the developmental organization of the way in which a cell can function in a multicellular organism. So within this idea of a genealogical trace that's present within the cell, we have this idea of endosymbiosis, whereby an organism, a bacteria, is inhabiting within another type of organism, whereby phylogenetic development and ontogenetic development are occurring and evolving simultaneously, but together in a participatory way. So this is a way that we might be able to reframe what we might mean by self and the individuation process that is a biologically situated phenomena. What are the possibilities in reorienting this as something that is akin to a vital force, or as Bergson says, the élan vital, or as Aristotle says, the intelligy, a quality of which permeates the entirety of an organism, that continues in that developmental orientation, but also resonance of what makes an organism particular to itself. These are the early stages of the research, and I hope that by reorienting this idea of the self as a vital capacity, that we might better understand what it means for an organism to develop in a way that makes an organism particular to its species, while continuing forth this larger genealogical trace relative to life itself. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your feedback.